As it turns out, and the reason why I wrote the book Real Magic, that what we study within a scientific context, something like clairvoyance, in the magical tradition would be called divination. Because divination is all about perceiving through space and time. That is exactly what clairvoyance is all about, perceiving through space and time. And there are proper, validated scientific ways of testing whether that's actually a real thing. And the short story is, yeah, it is a real thing. We can test it. So we have divination as a magical practice. We have something I call force of will, which is impressing your will onto the world and making it do things according to your will. And the third category is theurgy, which is communicating with or dealing with spirits or invisible, sometimes non-human entities of one type or another. So in each of these three classes, divination, force of will, and theurgy, there are analogs in the scientific world which have been tested and have been shown to be true.
Dean Radin is someone who has dedicated his life to the study of magic. He comes from a scientific perspective and shows all of the actual legitimate clinical research that demonstrates that psi phenomenon or magical principles are real. And in this podcast, we talk about not only the history, but also the practice and how to utilize these practices to live a more interesting and magical life. So enjoy this podcast with Dean Radin. Dean Radin, it's great to have you on the show, brother.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So I've been steeped in a world where magic is real. So the ontology, the realness of magic for me is something that I've been aware of for many years, at least since my first encounter with Quechua healer, Maestro Orlando Chuandama of the ayahuasca tradition, and started learning about and experiencing these altered states of consciousness that had access to realms where magic is just the normal course of business in those realms. And so this has been many years where my own personal experience with magic has been really present, and learning from the great lineage traditions, mostly in the medicine traditions, less so in the Western Crowley esoteric tradition, Blavatsky and that crowd. So it was really cool to read this book, which is approaching it from and it's not excluding, but it's approaching it from a lot of the Western magic kind of concepts and seeing how they apply to some of the understandings that I've had and experienced in my own ceremonial context and even outside of ceremony. So I wanted to ask you though first, because not everybody's going to be like me and have had experience that allows them to know in their body with full gnosis, to grok, if you will, that magic is real. So how would you define magic?
Well, first of all, I'm looking at it from a scientific perspective. And I do that because, first of all, I'm a scientist, but secondly, science is a way of gathering objective data about the nature of the world. And if magic only persisted as a subjective experience, then it would not be surprising why a lot of people would say, well, that's good for fantasy, but it's not real, because we equate real with objective, measurable events. So my understanding then of magic is that, first of all, it requires a different worldview than the worldview of science. Science starts with everything is matter and energy. It's reductive materialism. It's really, really good at understanding the nature of the external world, physical world. But it is not very good. In fact, it's not very good at all when trying to understand subjective experience or things having to do with mind or consciousness. So from a scientific perspective, a lot of scientists would say magic, traditional esoteric type magic, cannot exist, because from that perspective, you are literally your brain. You are your physical brain, and that's the end of the story. There's nothing else. From an esoteric perspective, or a philosophical perspective called idealism, the entire universe is made up of consciousness, not from matter. Well, that's the esoteric position, that the world is ultimately made out of consciousness. From that perspective, now it becomes pretty easy to understand why magical practices would work. because everything having to do with the mind is now primary over the physical world. So when you start thinking about certain things, whether it's involving ritual or some other method, that manifests into the world. That's taking a very different way of understanding reality. So what is magic then? Well, from a scientific perspective, it is exactly the same thing that scientists have been studying for over 140 years that we call psychic phenomena. And the reason why psychic phenomena are not part of the scientific mainstream is exactly the same reason why magic is not part of the mainstream. It's because it requires that there's something about the mind and consciousness that is able to do things in the physical world directly. So that's rejected by science. The difference is that with psychic phenomena, we're talking about telepathy, clairvoyance, those kinds of phenomena, we can use scientific methods to study them, to study these kinds of things. And as it turns out, and the reason why I wrote the book Real Magic, that what we study within a scientific context, something like clairvoyance, in the magical tradition would be called divination. Because divination is all about perceiving through space and time. That is exactly what clairvoyance is all about, perceiving through space and time. And there are proper, validated scientific ways of testing whether that's actually a real thing. And the short story is, yeah, it is a real thing. We can test it. So we have divination as a magical practice. We have something I call force of will, which is impressing your will onto the world and making it do things according to your will. And the third category is theurgy, which is communicating with or dealing with spirits or invisible, sometimes non-human entities of one type or another. So in each of these three classes, divination, force of will, and theurgy, there are analogs in the scientific world which have been tested and have been shown to be true. So that's a little bit of a long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's perfect, and there's so many places that I want to expand the brackets and talk about. The first is the kind of general worldview that you're talking about, and I appreciated you referencing and drawing in Aldous Huxley's perennial philosophy. But fundamentally, what we're talking about is a different worldview. In Hermetic principles, it's, I think it's the very first principle. All is mind, the universe is mental. It's actually seeing the substrate of all existence as participating in the one mind, right? Is that we're all participating in a greater substrate of existence. And I think part of the problem with science accepting this, which you really elucidate well in this book, is that it fundamentally requires, like you said, this other worldview to exist, a worldview that has, whether it's mind consciousness or whether it's, Shekinah in the work that I do with Rabbi Gaffney, or whether it's the Tao in some, Taoist practice, some force that exists that we're all participating in that has influence, at the very least, if not actually fundamentally inextricable from every single thing that we see, feel exists.
Yeah. No, it's true. And so one of the ways of getting around what seems to be an incompatibility, so we have reductive materialism on the one hand, we have idealism on the other, or the esoteric traditions. They seem like they're completely far apart from each other, and how in the world are we going to connect them? Well, first of all, the analogy I'll make here is the difference between classical physics and relativistic physics and quantum physics. So just because we developed relativistic physics and or quantum physics, it doesn't mean that classical physics is wrong. What it does mean is that the Newtonian way of understanding reality is a special case. It works at certain speeds, at certain sizes, and it works really well there. We're able to go to the moon based on Newtonian physics. We didn't need quantum mechanics for that.
We propel a rocket all the way up through space with force, and the force is enough to carry the mass of the rocket through the resistance of the atmosphere, and then, fucking physics. Yeah. Hooray.
And it works. So we don't throw that away. But what we do is the more that we begin to understand the nature of the physical world, Einstein developed relativity, which says, okay, at very fast speeds, at very high degrees of gravity, weird things start to happen. So suddenly there is no space and time, there is space-time. And time is flexible, and all of the things that we know from relativity. And then the further we go into it, we find at the very microscopic scale, quantum mechanics which is, again, very, very strange from an everyday point of view. So what do we do with classical physics? Well, the reason why these new developments are acceptable is because they encapsulate classical physics. Like if you start from relativity, you can figure out classical mechanics. If you start from quantum mechanics, you're still not quite sure how to develop classical mechanics out of it, but nevertheless, we see Newtonian physics as a special case. And this you see again and again in science. Somebody comes up with something, it works pretty good, doesn't quite explain everything, and sort of like around the edges of the explanation, we have these anomalies that start popping up. Well, scientists are interested in anomalies because it tells us that there was something about our original idea that wasn't quite right. Well, what do? We expand it. So now we still have the original core, but we have a more comprehensive understanding. So if you think of that as a general trend that happens within science, reductive materialism works really, really well for lots of things. It doesn't explain everything. There are these weird anomalies at the edges, psychic phenomena, magical effects, and so on, to say nothing of simply the act of conscious awareness itself, which is not explained by reductive materialism. So, okay, science as we currently see it today is a special case. Works for some things, doesn't work for everything. So we expand it. Well, how are we going to expand it? The direction that many scientists are beginning to entertain now is exactly what is talked about in the esoteric traditions. So the base is not matter and energy. The base is something like consciousness, which is simply part of the fabric of reality. The question then is, how do you get from pure awareness, essentially, into the physical world? Where does that come from? Well, look at the esoteric traditions, like the Kabbalah is explicitly about this idea, right? And most of the esoteric traditions have a way of describing how do you get from what amounts to awareness, pure awareness, and turn that into the physical world as we experience it. All of the traditions have an explanation. Whether they're correct or not is another issue, but that's what even very early on, all the way back into shamanism, that was a topic of study, of trying to figure out, well, we can kind of feel that the world consists of consciousness. It is one mind. And somehow that gets turned into stuff. Well, how does that work? So I think we're in the progress now of having a convergence between a scientific understanding of reality, which is beginning to expand, and I would claim that it's expanding directly into what we would otherwise call the esoteric traditions.
I don't keep up with all of the latest quantum physics kind of research, but I saw something that came out recently that's questioning what I believe they were calling local realism, which is the idea that things can happen independently of somebody observing them, as far as I understand it, but you probably can explain it better. But it was challenging that long-held belief that things are just constantly happening in the absence of observation by anybody. And so it appears that what is emerging from these fields is a co-participatory universe in which our observation, imagination is actually generating a lot of what we see as part of our reality.
Yeah, and if you look in the history of physics, you find people like John Wheeler, famous physicist from Princeton, came up with the idea of black holes and the Big Bang, goes with the words. His notion was that we live in a participatory universe, in which case that's not quite going as far as the esoteric idea that the mind creates reality or creates the physical world, but that it is deeply and intimately related to it in some way. So in that case, mind and matter are related or correlated in a way that they can't be extracted. So the metaphor is, it's as though reality is a coin, and you have heads and you have tails. So the heads is mind and the tails is matter, and they are the faces of ways that you can look at reality. The head and the tails are very different from each other, but they're obviously part of the same thing. And they're correlated. So if you flip it, the head, you know what's going to happen to the heads and tails because they're always going to be related to each other. Something like that is called dual aspect monism as a philosophy. That's gaining traction within certain domains of science today for people who are beginning to think about these topics. large chunks of science could care less. Like if you're involved in biology typically, or the neurosciences, you don't need to worry about these kinds of ideas because materialism works well enough. But if you're interested in the bigger questions, it doesn't work so well.
Yeah, yes, and every single clinical trial accounts for the placebo effect. And I think this is something that Dr. Joe Dispenza has made a big push to help people realize, like, let's not discard this phenomenon in which the thoughts of the mind are treating every single known condition, from knee surgeries to cancer diagnoses to whatever you could possibly imagine. The beliefs of the mind are affecting the matter of the body, the human biology, in a fundamental way. But instead of just isolating and trying to create studies that remove the possibility of the placebo effect, what if you actually harness that for your own benefit? And it's really almost crazy that most people out in the general mainstream public and in the narrative still are following this Cartesian split between mind and body, and imagining that mind and body are somehow separate, when we have thousands and thousands, probably tens of thousands, I don't know how many clinical studies have actually accounted for the placebo effect and shown beyond a shadow of a doubt that the placebo effect is incredibly real. Like you just can't deny it. So what does that mean? That means that thoughts affect matter, period. Like, end of story.
Yeah, no, you're right. That the paradigm, the scientific paradigm, infects every area of science and medicine. And what's interesting also is that if you're a fledgling scientist, you're in college or graduate school, learning your discipline, you're never exposed to the idea that there's a philosophy of science, or that the science is not fixed, right? It's almost taught like a dogma. Sometimes you're taught about the history of how do we get from there to here, and it's usually a pretty compelling history. Like, there's a lot of stuff about it that's real. It's pretty good. But it sidesteps what you just said. It sidesteps the idea that there's something about the mind, this internal sense of reality that we all have, which is deeply related to the external world, the internal and the external, which, by the way, the place where I work is the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And we were founded by Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut, who was exploring outer space. That's his job. But on the way back to the Earth, he had a mystical experience, which has nothing to do with the external world. It's all about the internal world. So when he returned to the Earth, he became just as interested in inner space as he was in outer space. So
from astronaut to psychonaut.
That's exactly right. Yes.
Yeah, that's this feels like, we're always looking outside for the next great discovery and the next piece of technology that can influence the external world. I think we're all sleeping on the advancements in the technology of being able to utilize our inner world, the inner sciences, the interior sciences of what our consciousness is capable of. And it feels like this is now, even though it's not getting potentially the mainstream attention that some of these other external scientific discoveries are, but it's still building in momentum. And what's curious to me is, like, what's going to be possible as the general field of belief opens up to these kind of magical practices and principles. Like, what's going to be possible as we start to train and harness and believe in these phenomena?
Yeah. So it's one of the topics I deal with in my book, because one of the reasons, there are many reasons for why the magical traditions have been suppressed, almost from the very beginning. I mean, up until maybe the beginning of the Enlightenment in the 16th and 17th century, everybody believed in magic. A lot of people used magic in various ways. But the beginning of science and also the beginning of organized religion began to squash it, and squashed it real good. So that today we see magic showing up on entertainment, but people consider it as fantasy. Except privately, they also think, well, maybe that's actually real. And there are plenty of people out there using magical methods, whether they know it or not. They might call it manifestation or affirmations, but that's, of course, part of the magical tradition. One of the reasons then that this topic is really interesting from a sociological perspective is, okay, we imagine we move along from society and this is no longer a woo-woo taboo. It's become mainstream in some way. That would cause a very dramatic shift in the way that civilization works. It would shift it in the sense that, first of all, within this tradition, magical tradition, or even just psychic traditions, there are no secrets. So how can you maintain government? How can you maintain the way that the law works, the way that business works, if there were no secrets? The only reason why people are at each other's throats all the time is because people are at each other's throats all the time is because this is the reason why the legal system takes forever. This is the reason why the legal system takes forever to know what's happening. Well, if there are no secrets, it's because they don't actually know what's happening. Well, if there are no effective use of telepathy and clairvoyance, the effective use of telepathy and clairvoyance, that would change everything, among other things. Well, then why doesn't everything change? Well, because there's a gigantic status quo. Why doesn't everything change? Well, because there's a gigantic status quo out there that is perfectly happy with the way things are, and they don't want things to change. Without going into conspiratorial thought. So, without going into conspiratorial thought, you can imagine then why there would be a lot of pressure to keep these kinds of topics out on the fringe, and to not start infiltrating and manipulating or changing the way that the world actually works today.
And if people are imagining that this suppression is happening now with the U.S. government, like, yes, but we got to go way back to the early days when actually many of the churches were trying to monopolize power and monopolize the power of these practices. So in the old Hebrew mysticism and lineage traditions, like only like the inner high rabbi was able to actually evoke the name of the divine, the true name of the divine in the sanctum sanctorum, the holy of holies. They were able to hold these magical practices inside the temple itself, right? So, and it wasn't democratized. Nobody else could speak it. Only there was certain rituals and rites that only the high rabbi could offer. And then same in the Catholic traditions, which I think you made a beautiful point there, where, some estimates that I've seen is that 10 million witches were burned throughout the history of the suppression of these pagan traditions and cultures and magical practices, like some astronomical number. And I haven't fact checked that number, so I'm not sure if it's accurate, but at the very least, a very large number. While at the same time, you made the point that there's 400,000 Catholic priests who are practicing magical rituals through giving the Eucharist, the blood and the flesh of the Christ. Now, it's probably been hollowed out of the actual magic that's happening there because they don't even know really what they're doing. But nonetheless, it's a magical practice. So the absolute hypocrisy of saying, no, we're going to practice magic, but if you do it, we're going to kill you.
It's part of the Catholic catechism. It's written there right in black and white. You cannot practice any form of magic. It's demonic.
But we can.
Well,
that's the ridiculous part.
But this is the catechism. This is the rules if you're going to be a Catholic.
Yeah.
Anything outside the context of priests doing it in a certain way, in a certain time, is considered demonic. And while some of us would look at that now and saying, well, clearly that's a matter of social control, a lot of people still follow that. So the kind of research that I do, occasionally somebody will be extremely interested in it and then end their comment with, and by the way, this is demonic. You're working with demons. And my response is, what? Where does that come? Well, it comes from people who start as children who memorize the catechism again and again and eventually get to the point where any form of magical practice is automatically demonic and needs to be shunned. That you see also in the U.S. government, because there's a large chunk of the U.S. government which is quite religious, and it blocks research in this area. So I know people, for example, that are at the National Science Foundation. You'd figure, well, if this stuff is real, it would be extremely important to understand from a scientific perspective because maybe our adversaries are using it against us. Wouldn't it make sense for us to kind of understand it better? There is no federal funding at all. Zero. Why is that? because Congress allocates money for things. And when it comes to this particular topic, including at the National Institutes of Health, there is zero funding because there are enough people who think it is demonic. In which case, so I stand back then as a scientist, and I'm saying that you're telling me that there are aspects of reality which you believe in, which we cannot study because you have a certain belief about it. And the answer essentially is yes. We can't study that. We're told not to study that because it's a bad thing. Well, if Marie Curie had not started studying the bad thing of radioactivity, it would be a very different world today. But science is all about uncovering what is unknown. And some of them can be used for bad and some can be used for good. And the same is true for magic. Magic is a kind of a power or a force, and you use that for good or for bad.
Yeah. Yes, I think that for me, it makes sense that there's some, kind of religious trappings and old momentum from these religious beliefs that are there. But it also seems to me that large parts of the U.S. government have been captured by the capitalistic principles of, big pharma, basically, in a way. And there's a certain sense of human sovereignty and our ability to actually manage our own lives and actually through our own intent and through our own belief to be able to access our inner healing that's available, which is very bad for business in the number one contributing financial force that's donating the most to, politicians' campaigns, is paying the most in advertising for the media. So I think it's probably a combination of the old religious beliefs and then the new religion, which is the religion of money. If you actually are thinking like, what are people actually worshiping now? People are worshiping money more than they're worshiping God at mass, And so I think both of those forces are trying to suppress human sovereignty, for different power and greed reasons.
Yeah, well, as you said, what I mentioned before about the status quo. The status quo is political power, economic power, any kind of existing power. They're happy with the way things are, so why would you want to change anything? So that's where a lot of the pressure comes from.
Yeah. We were mentioning the suppression and the burning of witches, which actually, is deeply saddened to read that it's still existing in many different countries. In Tanzania, there was a massive witch burning that was fairly recent, and so these practices are still going on, maybe not here in the US, but in some ways there's cancel culture and people are getting burned in their social identity, if not actually physically, which is a much better situation. Let's not even try to conflate the two and compare them. Obviously, like getting attacked on social media is not the same as, pitchforks and hot fire.
Although
like that's a different
some people to suicide.
It does. And it's not to minimize the effects of that, but it's also to say like, all right, like most of us are in a world where we can at least talk about this and not have to worry about an armed mob coming out in front of our house. But the one thing that was very interesting to me is, you hear stories about like Giordano Bruno, getting burned at the stake as a heretic for just basically talking about love. I mean, like it wasn't even anything having to do with anything that I could see that was very magical other than just he was just a really good guy, and I don't know his biography, super well, but there's so many people who were burned at the stake for just challenging some of the oppressive top-down control strategies of the church. But then there's this story you write about someone who was given his sainthood, and I remember it was Saint Joseph. I forget his name before he was Saint Joseph, but somehow he didn't get burned, and somehow he got turned into a saint, and he was probably the most magical. You call him a Merlin-class wizard in this book. So tell his story, and then I'm curious to know, like, why do you think, like what was? How did they decide to make him a saint and not actually to kind of cast him out like is the typical strategy?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There have always been people who have one form of psychic skill or another, either as an exceptional healer or as a prophet or something like that. If they're really lucky, they would have escaped the Inquisition, because the Inquisition's job was to find these people and basically squash them, get rid of them, if they were considered a threat. Well, so Joseph of Cupertino was early on became a member of the church, which was one reason why they decided maybe it's okay, we can turn him into a saint, because he's already inside the fold. But his special gift was that he was considered a kind of an odd boy. Today we might consider him possibly autistic, perhaps. He would go into flights of reverie and ecstasy upon praying, typically to the to one or another saints, and he would start levitating and flying. And so the other reason why the Inquisition probably didn't want to wipe him out was because he had done this in front of hundreds and hundreds of witnesses, including at the time clergy and royalty and other prominent people in whatever the governments were at the time where he was. And so many people had witnessed this, they of course considered it a miracle, and the church was taking advantage of this in the sense, I mean, not in a crass sense, although you could make a case that it was kind of crass. They took advantage of the miracle to show, see, we're right. Our understanding of reality is correct. And here's an example. All you hundreds of people have seen this person levitate as a result of praying for something within our religion. And so he was interviewed, in quotes, interviewed by the Inquisition at least twice, and probably came close to being decided that he was demonic, because levitation is not all that common.
And just for people to know, this is not some David Blaine, levitating like a couple inches off the ground. There's reports that are documented where he's levitating like 20 feet and 30 feet in the air.
It's the matrix, and it weaves all of creation together around the consciousness pole, which is at the center, connected to the divine. And this is one of the secrets of inner energy work. It often gets confused with the Kundalini channel going up the spine. They are not identical. There's a lot of hidden secret knowledge for the ancient Egyptians. The Egyptians say their mysteries were never betrayed. That means the real stuff that we knew and taught never got sent out to the public. You'll never learn what we were really doing. Everything has a pattern on every level, and everyone should be aware of this. Until then, you're a victim of unhealthy patterns and not knowing what the patterns are. It's the hidden side of sacred geometry. Today, people often talk about sacred geometry in a very amorphous way. It's kind of like a philosophical thing. But it was a practical energy side, which is why it's so incredibly important, because it's the key to everything. It's very common that people will only work on their mental, spiritual development, and they end up really growing the energy in their upper chakras. And so their upper chakras become very big and expanded, but their lower chakras become a tiny little stick, sometimes referred to as a lollipop pattern. The other side of that is the focus very much on physical body culture, on developing energetically, on developing strength. And that's also absolutely essential. But again, that can become one-sided, to where you can meet people who have the most incredible bodybuilder bodies, but you talk to them and there's not much going on intellectually. Now, I'm not saying that across the board at all. Those are the polarities that can exist. So some people are highly developed intellectually, spiritually, other people are very developed physically, energetically. But of course, we have to have both in balance. Now, this is an ancient teaching. So in the Himalayas, they talked about Shiva and Shakti. So Shiva is ultimate consciousness, and that's the development of our consciousness to a higher level. And it's represented as an immovable center. So geometrically, it has a representation, which will make sense to us later when we get to biogeometry. So Shiva is the ultimate consciousness and creates an immovable center. Then dancing around it is the feminine polarity, which is Shakti, and Shakti is ultimate energy, and she's what weaves and creates everything, just like it's women who give birth. So that female polarity is what actually creates the world. It's the matrix, and it weaves all of creation together around the consciousness pole, which is at the center, connected to the divine. Now, the same thing is true for every one of us. We literally have a Shiva pole in the center of our body. And this is one of the secrets of inner energy work from the Chinese Taoists, from advanced levels of Kashmiri Shaivism in India and things like this. From the crown to the perineum, there's a complete column of energy that is a central pole in the energy body that everything else comes out of and grows out of. But it's the most important energy axis in the body. It often gets confused with the Kundalini channel going up the spine. They are not identical. That's connected to the back channel, and we're talking about the absolute center of the body. So there's a connection here between how we develop our consciousness and how we develop the energy body. God didn't give us one foot to hop on. He gave us a left foot and a right foot. And you step forward with one, and then you step forward with the other, and that's how you make progress in a polarized world. We're given the polarities of consciousness and energy. You cannot develop your consciousness in a stable way to a higher level without having a strong energy body to support it. The physical body and the energy body is the base of the pyramid that the capstone of the consciousness has to be on, or the whole thing will crumble. But by the same token, if you don't have the consciousness developed, then there's nothing to guide you in the proper development of the physical and energetic bodies in a way that actually does create the type of longevity that the Chinese Taoists talked about, where it was common to live to be 150 years old. So there is an essential link here where to develop the energy and physical bodies to their fullest extent, not just for short-term muscular growth, but for long-term survival as a kind of Taoist immortal, that requires a lot of consciousness development and an analytical capacity. And by the same token, to develop our consciousness, we have to have a strong, supportive energy body. And so we really need people to understand that these two things are not exclusive. And we always need to keep checking in on ourselves. There's no stones to throw. We all make mistakes. We're all figuring it out. But if for people who have only developed on the consciousness side, was something that I did for a long time, then you have to work more on the physical body integrity and the energy body. And for the people that focus more just on that side, there has to be the work on the consciousness development. Because that beautiful body that you've developed, you're not taken with you through the gate of death. What you're taken with you through the gate of death is your consciousness and your ability to perceive in non-physical worlds. So this is one of the great secrets of sacred geometry. And that is this idea about, in modern physics, they had a complete revolution in physics based on the concept of wave and particle. So before they thought, well, everything's a particle. We just keep going deeper and deeper into smaller and smaller matter, and there'll be a final, indivisible little solid thing. That's what they thought in the 1800s, a little solid billiard ball of matter, and that's everything else forms from that. It's the materialistic dream. Well, that all got blown out in 1900 with the discovery of black body radiation and the quantum revolution in physics. And they said, oh, well, actually, we find out that there's both a wave and a particle. And particles, physical matter, get formed by the collapse of the wave. That's literally what they call the collapse of the wave function in modern physics. This means that our energy body is the wave, and it actually collapses or crystallizes all the forms in the physical body. Today, we analyze that in terms of things like stem cells and things like that. But the stem cells are just another part of the particle system. And what's really behind it is the wave, the outline of the human body that gets filled up with matter. The central axis in the body exists as an energy circuit in the body before the physical body ever forms. And the physical body forms around that central axis of energy. So it's not a physical structure in the body, it's an energetic structure. Now, what happened when we began to develop modern metaphysics, again with the advent of the Theosophical Society, which became the template for the modern New Age movement and modern metaphysics, is that they began to get bits and pieces of knowledge from different traditions. And we have to be aware that there's hidden secret knowledge in the Himalayas. There's hidden secret knowledge for the Chinese Taoists. There's a lot of hidden secret knowledge for the ancient Egyptians. The Egyptians say their mysteries were never betrayed. That means the real stuff that we knew and taught never got sent out to the public. Y'all never learned what we were really doing. And so they get little pieces of knowledge. So one of those things was they found about the Sushumna channel in yoga. But Sushumna, writ large, is really an interior channel along the spine that helps to move the energy up. That's very similar to what's called the governing vessel in Chinese medicine. It's quite similar, but there are some slight different structures because in reality, there is on the inside of the spine toward the center of the body, but not in the axial center, but along the interior of the spine, there's a channel of energy. There's another channel of energy that runs inside the spine. There's another one that runs, although not as well known, on the outside of the spine going up. Then there are the channels running up to both sides of the spine, the Ida and Pingala channels like you were talking about. And those channels don't only run up straight, they actually cross over, creating a caduceus pattern going up like you see in some of the Indian and Nepalese illustrations. All of this is connected to the energetic structures of the body that the physical matter forms around. And so what happened is that many traditions considered the absolute center channel of the body, what's referred to today in Taoist yoga as the thrusting channel or the Tai Chi pole, and had some other names in ancient Chinese. And then some of the knowledge coming from India. And in some of the Indian traditions, we have to be aware the Indian tradition, just like the Taoist tradition, was not one unified tradition where everybody did the same thing. It's the whole concept of Hinduism is a name for the conglomerate of a whole bunch of different sects and groups that teach things a different way, develop their energy body in different ways, but with similar core concepts of chakras and nadis, etc. Same thing for the Taoists. They have the same core concepts of the energy body, but they develop the energy body differently based on those concepts. So it's considered to be very secret that there's an energy channel running from the crown to the perineum, and that's the core energy channel of the body that interacts with, but is separate from the energy channels running on the four sides of the spine and crisscrossing on it. These are all different energy channels. So one of our fascinating opportunities today and challenges is to be able to properly put together the pieces of information from different traditions into a unified whole of the understanding of the subtle body and different practices. So if you go to any classical ancient spiritual tradition, they understood there are different levels of structure, different levels of manifestation. From the high divine level where you're connected with the one being of all things and all beings together as a unity. And then you go down to these multiple levels, given different names in different traditions, all the way down to the physical plane. And we need to understand that the electromagnetic is actually below the physical plane. It's not life energy, it's not above the physical, it's actually below it. The whole idea here is that there's a pattern behind everything. And so one of the things I describe in the Gaia series is that the ancient traditions are almost all uniform in saying where all physical structure comes from is a thought form in the mind of God, from that original unity field. It starts as a type of a thought form of a pure pattern. Then that pattern manifested the spiritual tradition as archetypal spiritual beings. Conscious spiritual beings as real as you and I, more real in some ways, much more advanced, that are an actual crystallization into conscious beingness of certain patterns and certain powers and certain functions. And then they understood that from there, you begin to form the patterns of karma, of actual physical incarnation, of what in the West and the Theosophical Society call the causal plane. Then you come down to the forming of the structures of how we understand things conceptually at the mental plane. Then it comes down to how it forms the structures of our emotional body, which is what really drives most of our behavior. And then it comes down to that wave talked about in physics of the etheric body, the chi, ki, prana level of vital life force. And that's a pure energy structure that then gives the structure that the physical matter then condenses or crystallizes around to create the physical body. And then when those life energy forces are used up constructing the physical body, they decay below the speed of light and they become the electromagnetic spectrum. So if we understand that as the basic understanding in the ancient world for how everything works, then we can understand that it's the patterns behind everything that are absolutely key. So we have to understand as we grow up from a child to an adult and start taking care of ourselves instead of somebody else taking care of us, that process of maturation in every lifetime is a type of microcosmic playing out in a single lifetime of what happens to us as a spiritual being across multiple lifetimes. We start not knowing anything, being very ignorant, and higher spiritual beings have to guide us and teach us. And then we incarnate in the physical body. We go through a whole series of those things. So our physical lifetime tends to be a microcosmic representation of the same pattern of the multiple lifetime journey. And this happens all over the place. Today we call it fractals, that this particular pattern exists on all scales of development. And so I show, for example, in the Gaia series, that something like the torus pattern. If you get a sphere, which is the primary form for holding consciousness and energy together, if you get a sphere, which is a holding form, and you open it up at the top and bottom so energy can flow through it, like an hourglass shape in the center, and then flow around the outside and then back to the center and back around the outside. That's a torus. An apple is based on a torus. You see it how it's indented at the top and the bottom. And then the core of it with the seeds is right in the center line, the same as our central channel in the body. Once you start to perceive these patterns, you see how everything is connected, and it's the same basic patterns that rule everything. The torus exists from the subatomic level. We have photographs of toroidal structures subatomically up to galactic levels that have toroidal structures. This is the idea of scale invariance, that regardless of how big or small the scale is, the same pattern is the key pattern to create the energy flow. But the same thing is true for us emotionally and mentally. All of us, I think, have had the experience where we grow up and we have these tremendous yearnings, emotional yearnings. Where's our missing half? Where's the person we're going to unify with? Where's all of my romantic aspirations I was taught to have as a young child, taking in media about that perfect partner I would have that would make my life complete? And we had that emotional yearning. And then through the school of hard knocks, with some relationships that maybe didn't work out well and we were very naive in, and we got knocked around, we began to say, oh, I better figure this out. And then we begin to see patterns. I have certain patterns of behavior I didn't know that screw up my relationships. I see dysfunctional patterns in other people, and maybe I can handle that in this person, but I don't want to deal with it in this person. It's just too dysfunctional. So we start seeing those patterns at the emotional level. Same thing at the mental level. How do I put my life together? How do I divide my time in the day? What's important and not important to me? Everything has a pattern on every level. And once you begin to understand these patterns, the same thing is true on the spiritual levels. There are patterns to how spiritual beings work and operate. And this is going to be important for us because when we pass through the gate of death, if we don't have some understanding for how spirit operates and we haven't developed any organs of spiritual perception, we're as deaf, dumb, and blind spiritually as Helen Keller was in the physical world, for she had to be guided around everywhere. And that's why you see these pictures in the old Egyptian tradition, like from the Papyrus of Ani, which we know as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and is better called the Book of Coming Forth into Light. That in that you see Ani, who's the initiate being trained, he's like bent over, hunched over, and he's got this greater being holding his hand and guiding him through these worlds that he's not able to navigate through or understand himself yet. That's what happens to every human being. Our goal is to develop to where we understand the patterns. You have a healthy body once you understand the patterns that make a healthy body. Until then, you're a victim of unhealthy patterns and not knowing what the patterns are. Same thing with your energy body. You have strong, vital force. You have to understand what the principles are for feeding that, both through the food we take in, through breathing practices, exercise, a whole variety of things. The emotional body being healthy, and you actually have a life that's emotionally full and fun and joyous, rather than a constant misery. Mental life, knowing how to control your own mind, so your mind doesn't destroy your life, but your mind becomes a superpower. All these things are based on the knowledge of pattern. That's such a great topic, because again, this is one of those things that should be Metaphysics 101 for people, but a lot of people never got. We don't get issued our Metaphysics 101 books, but whatever we happen to be exposed to in the world around us today, which is not always the most important information. So the key of everything is that, and all classical traditions agree on this, that everything came from a unity, the one. Now, in modern materialistic physics, they describe that state of unity, the one, where there is no polarity, there is no duality, everything is unified. They refer to this as the singularity. That singularity, according to physics, that unified state, which they don't understand anything about, they admit, is the source of all creation, because that unity, the one, split into polarity, the two. And then our whole world is based on polarity. Positive and negative charges with the electron and the proton. Positive and negative charges in electricity and magnetism. The opposites attract and the same repel. That's a universal principle that you'll see anytime you get a bar magnet, try to put the two similar poles together. They repel each other. You can feel something that feels like a gelatinous force field pushing them apart. And you get the two opposite poles, and you can't keep them apart. They want to be together. So what polarity does is it allows things to be separate, but energetically moving with each other, energetically affecting each other. That allows evolution. That allows dynamic development. Evolution as a spiritual being is only possible in a polarized world, in the school of hard knocks, here on the physical plane. And that's why we're sent here to a polarized world. Otherwise, we often, when we're suffering in the physical world, say, I just want to be back, in that blissful unity state that I came from, that we all subconsciously know exists and we subconsciously yearn for, and then sometimes dysfunctionally try to attain through things like opiates or things that put us in that state but destroy our physical lives. But we have a subconscious yearning for it, and that yearning can sometimes be addictive. We have to understand the reason for being here on the physical plane, or for actually having the internal fortitude to grapple with the polarized world, where we may suffer and we may not get what we want, but it's part of developing to a higher level than we were before. So everything is polarized, everything is split here. And so when the ancient knowledge of energy science from the old traditions got lost, it was reclaimed to begin with by French researchers in the early 1900s. The Chinese knew a lot about it, the Indians knew a lot about it, all these ancient cultures worked with it, but the people that we found that knew it the most was ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptians mastered the art of what they called shape-caused waves. These are the subtle energy waves coming from any geometric form or any shape. It's the hidden side of sacred geometry. Today, people often talk about sacred geometry in a very amorphous way. It's kind of like a philosophical thing. But it was a practical energy science. Biogeometry is reclaiming the practical energy science side of sacred geometry, which is why it's so incredibly important, because it's the key to everything. So Dr. Karim took that stuff back to Egypt, began to work with it, and he has an incredibly important mental question with us. He said the French identified all of the polarized energies that make up the life energy functions in the world. Everything inside your own energy body that creates every function you possibly need, whether it's more yin or more yang, or all these different types of functions. He said, but this is always shown by the French as a circle. And on the outside of the circle are all these different bands of energy. And again, one of them might activate this organ, and this other one will sedate this organ. They all have different energies, and they're polar opposites to each other. And he said, but they're not asking what's in the center of the circle. And so he, with this kind of brilliant Alexander the Great breaking the Gordian knot type of thing, he used this lateral thinking. And he said, in addition to the bands of polarized energies, all these bands have opposites, that the French discovered there's got to be something in the center that's a universal harmonizing energy that's not polarized. This is the energy from the original unity state, because the original unity state broke into the polarity that made up everything in our world. Two opposite genders, yin and yang, light and dark, hot and cold, all that stuff. So he's like, the French have mapped out all the polarized energies of the polarized split as it pertains to human life energy. But what about that unified field form from the papyrus of Ani, which we know as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and is better called the Book of Coming Forth into Light? That in that you see Ani, who's the initiate being trained, he's like bent over, hunched over, and he's got this greater being holding his hand and guiding him through these worlds that he's not able to navigate through or understand himself yet. That's what happens to every human being. Our goal is to develop to where we understand the patterns. You have a healthy body once you understand the patterns that make a healthy body. Until then, you're a victim of unhealthy patterns and not knowing what the patterns are. Same thing with your energy body. They have strong, vital force. You have to understand what the principles are for feeding that, both through the food we take in, through breathing practices, exercise, a whole variety of things. The emotional body being healthy, and you actually have a life that's emotionally full and fun and joyous, rather than a constant misery. Mental life, knowing how to control your own mind, so your mind doesn't destroy your life, but your mind becomes a superpower. All these things are based on the knowledge of pattern. That's such a great topic, because again, this is one of those things that should be Metaphysics 101 for people, but a lot of people never got. We don't get issued our Metaphysics 101 books, but whatever we happen to be exposed to in the world around us today, which is not always the most important information. So the key of everything is that, and all classical traditions agree on this, that everything came from a unity, the one. Now, in modern materialistic physics, they describe that state of unity, the one, where there is no polarity, there is no duality, everything is unified. They refer to this as the singularity. That singularity, according to physics, that unified state, which they don't understand anything about, they admit, is the source of all creation, because that unity, the one, split into polarity, the two. And then our whole world is based on polarity. Positive and negative charges with the electron and the proton. Positive and negative charges in electricity and magnetism. the opposites attract and the same repel. That's a universal principle that you'll see anytime you get a bar magnet, try to put the two similar poles together. They repel each other. You can feel something feels like a gelatinous force field pushing them apart. And you get the two opposite poles, and you can't keep them apart. They want to be together. So what polarity does is it allows things to be separate, but energetically moving with each other, energetically affecting each other. That allows evolution. That allows dynamic development. Evolution as a spiritual being is only possible in a polarized world, in the school of hard knocks, here on the physical plane. And that's why we're sent here to a polarized world. Otherwise, we often, when we're suffering in the physical world, say, I just want to be back, in that blissful unity state that I came from, that we all subconsciously know exists and we subconsciously yearn for, and then sometimes dysfunctionally try to attain through things like opiates or things that put us in that state but destroy our physical lives. But we have a subconscious yearning for it, and that yearning can sometimes be addictive. We have to understand the reason for being here on the physical plane, or for actually having the internal fortitude to grapple with the polarized world, where we may suffer and we may not get what we want, but it's part of developing to a higher level than we were before. So everything is polarized, everything is split here. And so when the ancient knowledge of energy science from the old traditions got lost, it was reclaimed to begin with by French researchers in the early 1900s. The Chinese knew a lot about it, the Indians knew a lot about it, all these ancient cultures worked with it, but the people that we found that knew it the most was ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptians mastered the art of what they called shape-caused waves. These are the subtle energy waves coming from any geometric form or any shape. It's the hidden side of sacred geometry. Today, people often talk about sacred geometry in a very amorphous way. It's kind of like a philosophical thing. But it was a practical energy science. Biogeometry is reclaiming the practical energy science side of sacred geometry, which is why it's so incredibly important, because it's the key to everything. So Dr. Karim took that stuff back to Egypt, began to work with it, and he has an incredibly important mental question with this. He said the French identified all of the polarized energies that make up the life energy functions in the world. Everything inside your own energy body that creates every function you possibly need, whether it's more yin or more yang, or all these different types of functions. He said, but this is always shown by the French as a circle. And on the outside of the circle are all these different bands of energy. And again, one of them might activate this organ, and this other one will sedate this organ. They all have different energies, and they're polar opposites to each other. And he said, but they're not asking what's in the center of the circle. And so he, with this kind of brilliant Alexander the Great breaking the Gordian knot type of thing, he used this lateral thinking. And he said, in addition to the bands of polarized energies, all these bands have opposites, that the French discovered there's got to be something in the center that's a universal harmonizing energy that's not polarized. This is the energy from the original unity state, because the original unity state broke into the polarity that made up everything in our world. Two opposite genders, yin and yang, light and dark, hot and cold, all that stuff. So he's like, the French have mapped out all the polarized energies of the polarized split as it pertains to human life energy. But what about that unified field force, that original energy of the singularity, that divine state in the center? And he actually then identified, using the French bands, particular energy bands that resonated more strongly with the center than others, particular sub-bands in the whole system. And that's what developed the concept BG3. In his initial work, he discovered 3 precise sub-bands within the 12-band system of the French that we use for practical purposes. It's not that hard to learn. Today, in the Biogeometry Advanced training, we'll teach people 28 sub-bands that resonate very strongly with the center. But we have to understand that these are where that center energy resonates with the polarized energies on the periphery very strongly, but in itself is a unity of the one in the middle. It has no duality or anything else. Now, what Dr. Karim found is that he could directly tap in to that unified field force, the universal harmonizing energy of the BG3, and that would harmonize and balance all other energies in existence, all the other energies that exist with all the other polarized bands. They get unified, tied together in the center, and harmonized. To harmonize all these different energies we have in our body and energy field, without the harmonizing force, everything just becomes chaos, and it just tears apart at every level of creation, including in the human body. But if you can amplify that harmonizing energy, everything improves. Everything gets better. It's the universal donor. That harmonizing energy of the BG3 is the only energy in existence, which comes from the divine plane, the original unity, that you cannot overdose on. So he created then, Dr. Karim created an entire system of biogeometry. This concept from the French of the shape-caused waves, where geometric forms emit particular energies of the bands, or if you know how to modify them, can actually emit the energy of that harmonizing universal field force, which Dr. Karim figured out how to do, and created the entire system of biogeometry. So biogeometry is about the effect of shape-caused waves and geometric energies on life forces.
last words of thrice great Hermes. Wise words, although written by my decaying hand, remain imperishable through time, imbued with the medicine of immortality by the All-Master. Be unseen and undiscovered by all those who will come and go, wandering the wastelands of life. Be hidden until an older heaven births human beings who are worthy of your wisdom. Having sounded this prayer over the works of his hands, Hermes was received in the sanctuary of eternity. Chapter 1. The Prophecies of Hermes. In this chapter, Hermes describes the nature of pure philosophy, but laments that in future generations it will become all but lost. Hermes' vision waits for its chance to awaken future generations who are lost and bewildered by life. People such as ourselves. The Prophecies of Hermes. Pure philosophy is spiritual striving through constant contemplation to attain true knowledge of Atom, the one God. But speaking now in prophecy, I say that in times to come, no one will pursue philosophy with single-mindedness and purity of heart. Those with a grudging and ungenerous temperament will try and prevent men discovering the priceless gift of immortality. Philosophy will become confused, making it hard to comprehend. It will be corrupted by spurious speculation. It will be entangled with bewildering sciences like arithmetic, music, and geometry. The student of pure philosophy studies the sciences, not as fanciful theories, but as devotion to Atom, because they reveal a universe perfectly ordered by the power of number, because measuring the depths of the sea and forces of fire and magnitudes of physical things leads to a reverent awe at the Creator's skill and wisdom, because the mysteries of music bear witness to the unsurpassed talent of the supreme artist, who has beautifully harmonized all things into a single whole, suffused with sweet melodies. To simply love Atom in thought with singleness of heart and to follow the goodness of his will, this is philosophy, unsullied by intrusive cravings for pointless opinions. But I foresee that, in times to come, clever intellectuals will mislead the minds of men, turning them away from pure philosophy. It will be taught that our sacred devotion was ineffectual, and the heartfelt piety and assiduous service with which we Egyptians honor Atom was a waste without reward. Egypt is an image of the heavens, and the whole cosmos dwells there, in this its sanctuary. But the gods will desert the earth.